Let's say you're of the age, be it middle school, high school, or maybe you're considering a college degree in music, where you get to step up from the instrument you started out on to something that's hopefully at this point a little bit more befitting of your skill and commitment level. This is an exciting day for many trumpet players, but it is one that should be treated with great caution, because, as it happens, these things cost money. A lot of it, to be exact. And before you get into finding a new daily driver for your trumpet playing, it's extremely important to know what's available on the market, what works for you, and maybe more importantly, what doesn't. This is a big subject, but today on Trumpet Demystified, we're going to do our best to tackle it. Welcome one and all to the season finale, if you will, of Trumpet Demystified, my senior project for the Gonzaga University Honors Program, where in today's episode we're going to be wrapping the series up by talking about how you can go about picking your ideal trumpet. Here is my ideal trumpet, my daily driver. I've had this one since the beginning of 8th grade. If you extrapolate, I am now in 16th grade, so if my subtraction skills serve me correctly, I've been playing this trumpet for a little over 8 years. That's a long time. That's much more than half the time I've been playing trumpet, which is in total about 11 years. And so this thing and I have had some time to grow close together, and there have been some ups and downs in the journey. There have been times where I've been really confident that this was the horn for me and I picked out the perfect choice. There have been other times where I felt that maybe I made a little bit of a mistake. Nowadays, I am very, very thankful for this instrument. I think it has served me better than most in the industry probably could have. But what's important to note is that this horn might not serve you nearly as well as it serves me. I am my own person and my own player, and you are your own person and player. This is a very individualized process that it's extremely important to be as informed about as possible. So today we are going to start general and then work our way down to the specifics. First off, some notes on who or what to listen to, or rather not to listen to, while searching for a new horn. Do not listen to the internet. The irony is not lost on me as somebody who is making a video right now for you to watch on the internet, and I'm not saying that the internet is not a good resource for information on trumpets. In fact, it's a great source that I've consulted once or twice or maybe a few thousand times over the years to come to you with information like this. But here's the trouble. The trouble is when you start seeing blanket statements on the internet, such as, X trumpet is the best in the industry for doing Y. Anytime you see a statement like that, alarm bells should be going off in your head. That is not a statement you can validly make for every single trumpet player in every single circumstance. In much the same vein as that, your band director and your parents, don't necessarily listen to them. They're very well-intentioned people who would like to see you succeed in the world of music, I would assume, anyway. But the trouble is, unless one or all of them happen to be professional trumpet players, the best they can really do is provide blanket statements or things they've heard from other people, or the internet. And while we're on the topic of blanket statements, definitely do not put too much stock in the words of advertisers, marketers, salespeople, anybody like that in the trumpet industry. I know I come off a little cynical when I say that, and I also furthermore come off very biased when I, as a content creator and reviewer of instruments here on YouTube, say things like there is more educational value to be gleaned from independent reviewers and forums and such sources than from advertisers and salespeople, but nonetheless, there's a lot less incentivizing going on the independent level than on the salesperson level. You've probably heard the old adage of try before you buy. That is 110% a valid statement in the trumpet industry. I am of the opinion that you will get nowhere with a horn search unless you are able to go somewhere and try different ones out and compare them to each other. And that ties into what you should be listening to or listening for. It's actually very simple. The only thing you really should be listening for is your sound on a particular instrument in several fashions. Firstly, your sound from your perspective behind the bell as a player, and secondly, your sound from the perspective of others. Firstly, record yourself as you try different horns. It's extremely valuable and something I myself should have done, even though I feel like I ended up with a good option. Even if it's just your cell phone, set it up, at the very least a few feet from your bell and get feedback from other trusted sources, be that your private teacher or anyone in your family who might be musical and has a discriminating ear. Those are optimal options, but even just anybody. The average layperson can tell some difference between instruments of certain calibers, so it's not harmful to get other feedback from outside ears, just as long as they're not incentivized to sell you a particular horn, as I've been alluding to. And time is extremely important here. Whatever it takes, listen back to recordings, listen to them over and over if you have to. Have conversations with people about what they're hearing. Take notes in a notebook to make sure you're being entirely fair and objective with all the instruments that you're trying. And speaking of time, don't be looking to make a radical change and immediately see improvements. To the more experienced of you, let's say you've played on a medium bore or a small bore instrument for years and years, you shouldn't just expect to plug your usual mouthpiece and your usual approach of playing into an extra large bore trumpet with a massive bell and just expect things to lock into place and go, oh yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for. First of all, like I said, quality time is important. You need some time to get acclimated. And also, there is something to be said about taking things incrementally with gear decisions and not trying to make a huge change right away. Now, as we get into the meat and potatoes of this video, we are going to be talking about how certain characteristics or features of a trumpet can predispose it to produce a certain sound. And sometimes that is helpful to know if you know exactly what you're looking for. But here's something else that's equally important for you to chew on. Your lips, your teeth, your tongue, your way of breathing are not going to be the same as the previous person's or the next person's. And that's what makes this such an individualized process. You, yourself, are predisposed to producing a certain sound and playing a certain way. And if the trumpet you've got in your hands feels harder to play than other instruments, it doesn't matter hardly a lick at all what sort of a sound it is predisposed to produce. You are going to be working too hard while you play it. And why is that an issue? Because there's a good enough correlation almost to suggest causation, which is to say an extremely good correlation, with more effort in your playing leading to you producing a less naturally pleasing tone. And this is the reason why, in the wise words of J. Robert Oppenheimer, theory can only take you so far. Because no matter how much research or testing your band director, your private teacher, or your parents do, ultimately there is no best trumpet in any particular category for every player. Some of the best sellers on today's professional trumpet market, I absolutely do not get along with. I sound markedly worse on them than, for instance, this instrument I've chosen out, and that is for a huge variety of reasons. Too many to detail in this video. But with that said, I think we've yammered long enough as a precursory sort of chapter to the rest of the chapters in this video, so let's get on with what these specs are that you could be looking out for if you know exactly what it is that you want and get along with. Now, of course, in the case of your average, typical music store with a few professional trumpets on display, you can't really expect to waltz in and test out extremes of every single specification in trumpet design, so in this video we're going to go over some specifications to look out for so that hopefully you can be better informed and maybe narrow down your potential list of candidates if you at least have some idea of what you're going for. You might be able to tell, first of all, that I'm a fairly sound-guided player. When I try a new instrument, I really like to hear a pleasing sound. It helps me to play with a little bit less effort, and it's a positive feedback loop because less effort generates a better sound because I don't feel like I'm forcing the horn to do my bidding. But nonetheless, there are a few good ways to look at a horn and be able to tell to some extent the sort of sound that it'll be predisposed to produce. For instance, the bell. If you're really looking, for instance, for the darkest possible sound from your trumpet playing, you might consider a bell that looks a little bit more orange or pink or red in color because the brass has more copper, which is naturally predisposed to a little bit of a darker sound. You might also be looking for a wider flare or a wider throat to spread out your sound a little bit more, and you might be looking for a heavier bell with a little bit thicker metal, as these are all properties that generally tend to produce a richer and warmer sound. More mid to low frequencies, maybe the same amount or less of some of the high frequencies, depending on which parameters you vary. Meanwhile, if you're looking for a brighter sound, you might be looking for bells that are made from nickel silver or sterling silver or something like that. They're fairly uncommon. Yellow brass tends to do the job if you need a bright sound, just as long as the bell's not too big and not too heavy. Nice lightweight, smaller flare bells tend to do well in that area if you're really looking for a cutting lead trumpet sound, for instance. Another great place to look is, shocker, not where the vibration ends, but where the vibration begins, the lead pipe. The shape and taper of the lead pipe is extremely important. For instance, if you're looking for a darker sound, you might be looking for something with a slightly more conical lead pipe. Maybe a smaller venturi, maybe a larger lead pipe opening. Bore sizes can get very tricky, but here is a good example of a very conical lead pipe. This trumpet has a smaller bore than usual, a medium as opposed to a medium-large, at the valve section. But this is a very conical lead pipe, and moreover, this trumpet is supposedly designed with a step bore. So, this lead pipe, which goes all the way to here since it's a reverse pipe instrument, has a certain amount of flare to it, and it comes out supposedly to a diameter here that is wider than the diameter down here. The diameter actually shrinks inside the tuning slide, which allows for a smaller bore at the valve section, but nonetheless a more conical lead pipe. And because of the smaller bore, you get a more conical bell section. And that leads to a horn that's supposed to be good for lead trumpet applications, also having an amazing ballad sound, sounding really rich and creamy in the soft dynamics. And while I've got you on the topic of bore size, here's something to chew on, and this is something that not a lot of people consider, but really explains a lot about the trumpet industry. A lot of trumpets' slides are manufactured from the same stock tubing, regardless of what the bore is supposed to be. So this means that when you take this stock tubing of constant outer diameter and machine it to be a medium bore, you're left with thicker tubing walls than if you use a medium large bore. That results in thinner walls. And that means that on a large bore, more of your mid and low frequencies are actually being radiated out or lost when you play. And on a medium bore, conversely, there is less frequency loss, meaning that you're getting more mids and lows in your sound, which could explain, if you happen to sound brighter on large bores, why that might be the case, even though it might seem counterintuitive. Another issue of general importance when selecting an instrument, the exact importance of which can vary from player to player, is the response of the instrument. For instance, my 8310Z has a famously lightning-fast response and is very dependent on the impulses of the player. Every trumpet player looks for a different response from their instrument, but essentially this instrument is a very good listener and it always knows exactly what to say back to me when I talk to it as a player. Reasons you might prefer a lightning-fast response are easier articulations, something that I generally struggle with, and a tone that you are able to supply a little bit of input into that's not locked into a particular spot on the tonal spectrum. Again, something that I personally prioritize as someone who plays various styles of music. Optimal response a lot of the time comes from a relatively lightweight horn. Thinner tubing, maybe a thinner bell, or in the case of this instrument, a little bit less bracing than you tend to find on most instruments. For instance, no tuning slide braces whatsoever, whereas on a lot of trumpets you have at least one on the tuning slide, sometimes another one on the lead pipe, assuming that you don't have a reverse lead pipe that prohibits that from happening. And funnily enough, one less brace on the third slide than a lot of trumpets, for instance, the famed Bach Stradivarius. Now, just to be clear, I don't advocate for everybody playing on a lightweight instrument, but for me, the benefits of the lightweight instrument are the fact that I have a more flexible tonal experience and can put a little less priority on the articulations. And like we said, when you struggle with something, it's best to minimize that because more effort leads to a worse sound, pretty much regardless of what kind of a player you are or what kind of a horn you play on. Flexibility is another big one. We tend to like, as trumpet players, the ability to go from high notes to low notes as is demanded of us. And if you are the type of player who does a lot of lead trumpet or studio work, or plays a lot of really strenuous solo repertoire that spans the full range of the instrument, you might prioritize flexibility when selecting an instrument. There are a few traits that can help here. Like with response, a lightweight bell or tubing is generally not such a bad thing, as less weight allows you to transition more easily between partials and registers on the instrument. And this is where I might be a little biased, but I truly think that medium, large, and especially medium bores on the smaller end of the spectrum tend to be a little bit more flexible or provide the player with better flexibility than large bores. I have my own set of issues with the way the more open large bore is marketed, but one of those things is I find the freest playing experience in terms of flexibility to actually be on smaller horns like this one. Another thing I personally find helpful in terms of response is what you see here. A reverse lead pipe, wherein the lead pipe leads into an inner slide tube as opposed to a conventional outer tube, where the inner tube is understandably attached to the tuning crook. This has a variety of consequences. For one thing, the lead pipe tends to be a little bit more conical because rather than the lead pipe stopping here, it stops here, and so there's more time for the tubing to expand a little bit more gradually or a little bit more in general. And additionally, this bell brace here tends to be a little bit further out on a conventional lead pipe, but because the outer tubing ends here on a reverse lead pipe, it has to be moved back a little bit, and that leaves a little bit more of the bell to vibrate freely, which has its own flexibility consequences. And again, I don't advocate that everybody use a reverse lead pipe trumpet for their daily driving, but for me at least, it seems to have yielded significant benefits, be it this Yamaha, or the Bach LR series, or certain Schilkes, or certain Kanstel or Carroll brass models. Typically, my favorite trumpets all have reverse lead pipes, and so I do think it's worth everybody at least trying it out. You might be surprised by the benefits. Now, if your main priority is sheer ease of volume, ease of blow, ease of being heard out in the audience, which is, sometimes a trait of trumpet players, then we really are looking at a different set of parameters. We might be looking at things like a heavier bell or heavier valve trim or thicker walled tubing to really reflect as much of the frequencies as possible and dissipate as little as possible. You might experiment with a large bore if what you're looking for is really a few extra decibels on the sound, because while the large bore doesn't necessarily let more air through the instrument, since that's kind of limited by the mouthpiece throat, It can definitely put on a few extra decibels since the amplitude of vibration is a little bit wider. And also back on the topic of the bell, you might be looking for harder bell metals, either brass that's been tempered less during the manufacturing process, or alloys that have a little bit less copper and more things like zinc or nickel or tin. That tends to make you heard a little bit better in a large space. But then again, even if your work calls for you to play generally on the louder side of the fence, you, like me, might not be a true trumpet player at heart and might not enjoy sounding like heavy artillery while playing. And in that case, you might still opt for things like the heavier bell or the larger bore, but you might scale back in an area like materials, for instance. You might go for a bell that's been annealed a little bit more, been softened a little bit more, and it produces a softer sound, or has, again, a little bit more copper in it, like rose brass or red brass or gold brass. Generally, the most important thing in this area is knowing whether it's your job to play loud and bright, or loud and blended, a little bit less invasively. Now, like I said earlier in the video, because of our individuality as players, we experience different things from different horns, so I can't definitively recommend or advocate for a certain horn for a certain style of playing. But then again, there are certain market trends that tend to work out for a lot of players. For instance, there are horns that are supposed to sit right in the middle of the tonal compass and not deviate too far in any direction, and they're meant to have, just a nice pleasing classical concert tone that's generally not offensive in any way, no matter what volume you play at, even if it does have generally a lot of brightness and crispness to it. That includes things like the Box Stradivarius 37, certain Yamaha Xeno or Artist models that tend to sound a little bit like Strads, things like that. A lot of trumpets fall into that general category. Then you might be looking for a trumpet that has a bright but fairly contained sound, good for, jazz and studio work, good for lead work. That's generally things like the Yamaha Artist models for artists like Wayne Bergeron, Eric Miyashiro, Bobby Shu, who designed my 8310Z for whatever it's worth. Certain models of Schilke, the Bach 43, the Getzen Eterna, things like that, tend to have a nice, tight, high register sound, very crisp, but you also might be looking for a little bit more ballsiness in your tone, and there are certain marching band-oriented trumpets that are good in that area, certain canstils, king trumpets a lot of the time, certain Getzens, those tend to do well in that area of just playing really loud and really bright, although they can detract from certain other areas. And then this really differs for players, but there are some instruments that might favor a darker sound. I've had good luck with Courtois instruments. There is the Bach 72 Stradivarius that might work well in that sense. Certain ones like the Kanstel 900 or the Getzen 490 that really do produce a darker sound, those can be a lot of fun to play on, but it's extremely important to know your tendencies as a player and what is called from you as a player. And a personal anecdote here that might serve as a fun case study for just how individualized we are as players. I said things like the Bach Strad 37 are supposed to sound generally inoffensive no matter where you stick them or how you play them. I sound offensive when I play a Strad 37. Like I said, I sound markedly worse on it than something like my Yamaha 8310Z. Meanwhile, a lot of players sound a little offensive on this. They might sound a little bit too bright or a little bit too constricted in some ways. That is the case for a lot of people trying out a specialized jazz horn like this, and in general, it's supposed to produce a nice, bright, sizzling tone. I find I sound darker on it than on a Strad 37, but I'm also able to play fairly bright on it without the tone quality breaking up too much. And so this thing tends to be a good choice for me, pretty much regardless of style, and I play a wide range of styles, so that says something. And for what it's worth, I am generally a fairly bright sounding player. I have to compensate for my brightness with things like big and deep mouthpieces. So it is very ironic, and that irony is once again not lost on me, that I play a horn that is generally considered to be very bright, or to at least excel at producing a bright sound. But I find it's best for me regardless of whether I'm trying to play bright or dark. Regardless of how rambly or long-winded it's turned out, I hope this discussion has been informative for you trumpet players in the audience, particularly if the day is coming up for your next purchase. And if it is, I congratulate you, and I hope you'll take the time to enjoy and savor trying as many instruments as possible, but also that you'll take it fairly seriously with the knowledge that this is an axe you might be settling down with for a long time, and it's important that you, an individual player, enjoy playing that individual horn. Feel free to save this video and come back to it as you need, consult this information appropriately and with several grains of salt, but nonetheless I hope that it is helpful in your pursuits. If you have any follow-up questions whatsoever, please put them down in the comments. I'm happy to answer anything you've got, particularly as, sadly, this is where we put a bow on Trumpet Demystified as a whole. This is the 6th and final episode, I'm sad to say. It's been a lot of fun producing this series for you guys, and moreover, if I may gush for a second, it was a lot better received than I expected. I really thought that this project was kind of going to fly under the radar a little bit, not be terribly well received. Of course, not poorly received or anything, because I would hope it's fairly informative and helpful, but maybe just a little bit too involved for people. But I am very proud to say that the up-and-coming generation of trumpet players seems to be just as nerdy as I am, and that makes me so happy. I think it's safe to say that outside of the confines of this Honors Senior project, there will be more videos like this as a result of how this series has performed. So make sure to leave some comments with what other topics you'd like to see discussed, whether in terms of trumpet or other brass instruments, because after all, I'm Samuel Plays Brass, not Samuel Plays Trumpet. But that is where we'll put a bow on Trumpet Demystified. Thank you so much for your time, and until next time, stay tuned.